Welcome to Soft Mystic Stories. Imagine a time when nothing existed. No light, no sound, no life, just empty darkness stretching forever. This is where our story begins. Not with people or places, but with the very moment when everything you see around you came to life. This is the story of how the world was born, how the first people lived, and how everything changed when they made one terrible choice. It's a story of beauty and tragedy, of love and loss, of beginnings that would shape every moment that followed. In the very beginning, as Genesis 1:1 tells us, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, but the earth wasn't like anything we know today. Verse 2 shows us a picture of complete emptiness. Now, the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Then something amazing happened. God spoke, just spoke, and when he did, light burst into existence. Genesis 1-3 records his first words, and God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. Can you imagine that moment? The very first light piercing through endless darkness. God saw that the light was good, and he separated it from the darkness, calling the light day and the darkness night. This was the first day. On the second day, God looked at all that water and decided to make space. He created the sky by separating the waters above from the waters below. As verse 7 explains, so God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it, and it was so. He called this space sky. The third day brought even more wonders. God gathered all the water on earth into seas and let dry ground appear. But he wasn't finished. The earth was still empty. So he covered it with life. Then God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants, and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds." And it was so. Genesis 1:11 tells us, "Suddenly grass sprouted, flowers bloomed, and trees grew tall and strong." Day 4 was when God decorated the sky. He made the sun to rule the day and the moon to rule the night. As Genesis 1:16 describes, God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. Every twinkling star in the night sky was placed there by his hand. On the fifth day, God filled the waters and the sky with living creatures. Genesis 1:21 shows us the incredible moment. So God created the great creatures of the sea and every living thing with which the water teems and that moves about in it according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. Fish swam in the oceans, birds soared through the air, and God saw that it was good. The sixth day was special. First, God made all the animals that live on land. But then he did something completely different. Genesis 1:26 records his words. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea, and the birds in the sky, over the livestock, and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." This was the moment when the first human beings came into existence. After 6 days of incredible work, God did something that might surprise you. Genesis 2:23 tells us, by the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. Now, let's look closer at how God made the first people. Genesis 2-7 gives us the beautiful details. Then the Lord God formed a man from the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. God didn't just speak Adam into existence like he did with light or stars. He got his hands dirty, forming Adam from the dust, then breathing his own breath into him. That's how special humans were to God. But God knew Adam needed a perfect place to live, so he planted a garden in a place called Eden. Genesis 2:8-9 describes it. Now the Lord God had planted a garden in the east in Eden, and there he put the man he had formed. The Lord God made all kinds of trees grow out of the ground, trees that were pleasant to sight and good for food. This wasn't just any garden, it was paradise. Two special trees grew there, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Rivers flowed through Eden, keeping everything green and beautiful. Adam had everything he could ever want or need. God gave Adam an important job. As Genesis 2:15 explains, the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. Adam wasn't lazy. He was the world's first gardener, taking care of this amazing place God had made. But then God said something that shows how much he cared about Adam's happiness. Genesis 2:18 records, "The Lord God said, 'It is not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him.'" Even in paradise, Adam needed companionship. First, God brought all the animals to Adam to name them. Genesis 2 hours, 19 minutes and 20 seconds tells us, "Now the Lord God had formed out of the ground all the wild animals and all the birds in the sky. He brought them to the man to see what he would name them. And whatever the man called each living creature, that was its name. So the man gave names to all the livestock, the birds in the sky, and all the wild animals. But for Adam, no suitable helper was found. So God did something amazing. He made Adam fall into a deep sleep, and from Adam's rib he created woman. When Adam woke up and saw her, his reaction was pure joy. Genesis 2:23 captures his excitement. The man said, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man." The Bible tells us in Genesis 2:25 that Adam and his wife were both naked and they felt no shame. They lived in perfect harmony with each other and with God. There was no fear, no embarrassment, no conflict, just pure, innocent love. Life in Eden was perfect, but God had given Adam and Eve one rule. Genesis 2 hours, 16 minutes, and 17 seconds records God's words. "And the Lord God commanded the man, 'You are free to eat from every tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. For when you eat from it, you will certainly die.'" One rule in all of paradise, with thousands of trees to choose from. There was just one tree they couldn't touch. It seemed simple enough, but then a serpent appeared. This wasn't just any snake. This was the craftiest creature God had made. Genesis 3:1 introduces him. Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God really say, 'You must not eat from any tree in the garden'?" Notice how clever the serpent was. He didn't start by telling Eve to disobey. He just asked a question that made her think about God's command in a different way. Eve corrected him, explaining that they could eat from every tree except one, and if they ate from that tree or even touched it, they would die. But then the serpent made his move. Genesis 3:45 records his lie, "You will not certainly die. You will not certainly die." The serpent said to the woman, "For God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." Those words changed everything. Suddenly, Eve began to see the forbidden tree differently. Genesis 3-6 describes what happened next. When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eyes, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. She also gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate it. The moment they ate that fruit, everything changed. Genesis 3-7 tells us, "Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves." For the first time, they felt shame and fear. When God came walking in the garden in the cool of the day, as he always did, Adam and Eve hid. Genesis 3-8-9 shows us this heartbreaking moment. Then the man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord God as he was walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And they hid from the Lord God among the trees of the garden. But the Lord God called to the man, "Where are you?" God knew exactly where they were, but he was giving them a chance to come forward and admit what they had done. Instead, when Adam finally answered, he did something that showed how deeply sin had already affected him. Genesis 3:12 records his response. The man said, "The woman you put here with me, she gave me some fruit from the tree, and I ate it." Adam didn't just fail to take responsibility. He actually blamed both Eve and God himself for what had happened. When God asked Eve what she had done, she also shifted blame, saying in verse 13, "The woman said, 'The serpent deceived me, and I ate.'" God's response to their disobedience was both just and heartbreaking. First, he dealt with the serpent. Genesis 3 hours, 14 minutes, and 15 seconds records the curse. So the Lord God said to the serpent, "Because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and all wild animals. You will crawl on your belly, and you will eat dust all the days. Oh, your life, and I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." Then God turned to Eve. Genesis 3:16 shows the consequence for women. To the woman he said, "I will make your pains in childbearing very severe. With painful labor you will give birth to children. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you." Adam's punishment was different, but equally serious. Genesis 3 hours, 17 minutes, and 19 seconds records God's words to Adam. He said, "Because you listened to your wife and ate fruit from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat from it. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat food from it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken. For dust you are, and to dust you will return." Work which had been joyful in Eden would now be hard and frustrating. The ground would fight against them, and most devastating of all, death had entered the world. But even in judgment, God showed mercy. Genesis 3:21 tells us, "The Lord God made garments of skin to clothe them. He cared for them even after they had disobeyed him." Then came the moment they must have dreaded. God explained why they had to leave Eden. Genesis 3:22-24 records his reasoning, and the Lord God said, "The man has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil. He must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life, and eat and live forever." So the Lord God banished him from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he had been taken. After he banished them, he placed on the east side of the Garden of Eden cherubim and a flaming sword flashing back and forth to guard the way to the tree of life. Adam and Eve found themselves outside paradise in a world that was broken because of their choice. They could never go back. Outside of Eden, life continued. Genesis 4:1-2 tells us about the first children. Adam made love to his wife Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. She said, "With the help of the Lord I've brought forth a man." Later, she gave birth to his brother Abel. Now Abel kept flocks, and Cain worked the soil. These two brothers grew up in a world very different from the one their parents had known. They had never seen Eden, never walked with God in perfect harmony, but they knew about God and they brought him offerings. Genesis 4:34 describes their worship. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. And Abel also brought an offering, fat portions, from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. We don't know exactly why God preferred Abel's offering, but we can see the difference in their hearts. Abel brought the best he had, the fat portions from the firstborn animals. Cain just brought some of his crops, not necessarily the best. God's rejection of his offering made Cain angry. His face fell, and jealousy began to grow in his heart. But God, in his kindness, tried to warn Cain. Genesis 4-6-7 records God's words. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." God was giving Cain a chance to make things right. He was warning him that sin was like a wild animal waiting to pounce, but Cain had to choose to fight against it. Sadly, Cain made the wrong choice. Genesis 4-8 tells us the tragic, icy result. Now, Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let's go out to the field." While they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. This was the first murder in human history. Brother killed brother out of jealousy and anger. When God asked Cain where Abel was, his response showed how deeply sin had corrupted his heart. Genesis 4-9 records his callous answer. "I don't know," he replied. "Am I my brother's keeper?" But God knew what had happened. Genesis 4:10-12 shows his response. The Lord said, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth." Cain's punishment was severe, but not as severe as it could have been. When he complained that his punishment was too hard and that anyone who found him would kill him, God showed mercy. Genesis 4:15 tells us, "But the Lord said to him, 'Not so. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over.'" Then the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him. Even in judgment, God protected Cain's life. After killing his brother, Cain left his family and went to live in the land of Nod, east of Eden. There his wife had a son named Enoch, and Cain built the first city, naming it after his son. Genesis 4:17 records this. Cain made love to his wife, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Enoch. Cain was then building a city, and he named it after his son, Enoch. Cain's descendants became the founders of civilization as we know it. They weren't content to live simple lives. They created new ways of living, new technologies, new forms of art. Genesis 4 hours, 19 minutes and 22 seconds introduces us to some of Cain's most famous descendants. Lamech Mar. Ride 2 women, one named Ada and the other Zillah. Ada gave birth to Jabal. He was the father of those who live in tents and raise livestock. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all who play the harp and flute. Zillah also had a son, Tubal-Cain, who forged all kinds of tools out of bronze and iron. These men were innovators. Jabal invented nomadic life, living in tents and moving with herds of animals. Jubal created music, making the first harps and flutes. Tubal-Cain was the world's first metal worker, creating tools from bronze and iron. But with civilization came more violence. Lamech, Cain's descendant, became even more violent than his ancestor. Genesis 4:23-24 records his boastful song. Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, "Listen to me. Wives of Lamech, hear my words. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. Lamech was proud of his violence. He killed not in a moment of jealous rage like Cain, but in revenge for a simple injury. Violence was growing worse in the world. Meanwhile, back with Adam and Eve, life continued. They had lost Abel, and Cain had been banished, but God gave them another son. Genesis 4:25 tells us Adam made love to his wife again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Seth, saying, "God has granted me another child in place of Abel, since Cain killed him." Seth represented a new beginning, a chance for humanity to choose a different path than the one Cain had taken. And indeed, something wonderful happened in Seth's family line. Genesis 4:26 records this important moment. Seth also had a son, and he named him Enosh. At that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. This was significant. While Cain's descendants were building cities and creating technologies, Seth's descendants were seeking God. They remembered their Creator and called on His name in worship and prayer. Genesis 5 gives us the family line of Seth, and it's full of remarkable people. There was Enoch, who walked faithfully with God. Then he was no more because God took him away. Genesis 5:24 tells us this amazing story. Enoch was so close to God that God simply took him to heaven without him dying. The ages of these early people were incredible. Adam lived 930 years. Seth lived 90 years. Methuselah, the oldest man who ever lived, reached 969 years. Genesis 5:27 records, altogether, Methuselah lived a total of 969 years, and then he died. These long lives show us how different the world was then. People lived for centuries, had time to accumulate vast knowledge and experience, and could see many generations of their families grow up. But even in Seth's godly line, we see the constant reminder of death. Again and again, Genesis 5 repeats the phrase, "And then he died." Death, which had entered the world through Adam and Eve's disobedience, touched everyone. As time passed and the population grew, something terrible began to happen. The godly line of Seth and the violent line of Cain began to mix, and the results were disastrous. Genesis 6:1-2 describes the beginning of the end, when human beings began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them. The sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. This mixing of the godly and ungodly lines led to spiritual disaster. The people who had once called on the name of the Lord began to forget Him. Violence and wickedness spread like a disease across the earth. God saw what was happening, and His heart was broken. Genesis 6:5-6 gives us one of the saddest verses in all the Bible. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was on why evil all the time. The Lord regretted that He had made human beings on the earth, and His heart was deeply troubled. Can you imagine how God felt? He had created humans in His own image, breathed His own breath into them, given them a beautiful world to live in, and now they had become so wicked that every thought in their hearts was evil all the time. The violence that had started with Cain killing Abel had spread everywhere. Genesis 6:11 tells us, "Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence." It wasn't just individual sins anymore. The whole world had become a place of corruption and brutality. God made a heartbreaking decision. Genesis 6-7 records His words. "So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them." The world that had begun with such beauty and hope had become so evil that God decided to start over. But even in His judgment, God's mercy would shine through. Genesis 6-8 gives us hope. "But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord." The story of creation had led to paradise, then to disobedience, then to murder, then to civilization, and finally to complete corruption. But it wasn't over. A God had a plan to save humanity through one righteous man and his family. In a world drowning in violence and evil, one man stood apart. His name was Noah, and Genesis 6-9 describes him this way. This is the account of Noah and his family. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. While everyone around him had forgotten their Creator, Noah remembered. While others chose violence and wickedness, Noah chose to follow God's ways. Noah wasn't perfect. No human being except Jesus ever was. But in a world where every thought of people's hearts was evil all the time, Noah's heart was different. He loved God and tried to live the way God wanted him to live. Genesis 6-9 tells us he was blameless among the people of his time. This doesn't mean he never made mistakes, but that compared to everyone else, he was trying to do what was right. God noticed Noah's faithfulness. While he was planning to destroy the earth because of its wickedness, he decided to save Noah and his family. Genesis 6:13 records the moment when God spoke to Noah. So God said to Noah, I am going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I'm surely going to destroy both them and the earth. Can you imagine how Noah felt when God told him this? Everyone he knew, his neighbors, friends, maybe even extended family members, was going to be destroyed. The entire world as he knew it was coming to an end. It must have been terrifying and heartbreaking at the same time. But God had a plan to save Noah and start fresh with the human race. Genesis 6:18-19 shows God's promise. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you will enter the ark, you and your sons and your wife, and your sons' wives with you. You are to bring into the ark 2 of all living creatures, male and female, to keep them alive with you. God was giving Noah an incredible responsibility. He wasn't just saving Noah's family, he was making Noah responsible for saving every kind of animal on earth. This was going to be the biggest rescue mission in history, and Noah was going to lead it. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. These 4 men and their wives would be the only humans left alive after the flood. From their families, the entire world would be repopulated. The future of humanity rested on Noah's shoulders. What's amazing is that Noah didn't argue with God or ask for proof. Genesis 6:22 simply says, Noah did everything just as God commanded him. When God said, build an ark, Noah started building. When God said, gather animals, Noah started gathering. His faith was complete and immediate. God gave Noah very specific instructions for building the ark. Genesis 6:14-16 records the details. So make yourself an ark of cypress wood, make rooms in it, and coat it with pitch inside and out. This is how you are to build it. The ark is to be 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. Make a roof for it, leaving below the roof, an opening 1 cubit high all around. Put a door in the side of the ark and make lower, middle, and upper decks. This wasn't going to be a small boat. A cubit was about 18 in, so the ark was about 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. That's longer than a football field, and as tall as a 4-story building. It was going to be massive, with 3 decks and rooms throughout for all the animals and supplies they would need. Building something this big would have taken years. Noah had to cut down countless trees, shape the wood, and put it all together without modern tools or machinery. Every day as he worked on this enormous boat, people probably laughed at him. After all, they weren't near any ocean, and it had never rained enough to need such a huge boat. But Noah kept building, trusting that God knew what he was doing. Genesis 7-5 reminds us. And Noah did all that the Lord commanded him. He was 600 years old when the flood came, which means he had been working on this project for many years, never giving up, despite what others might have said about him. As the ark neared completion, God gave Noah another instruction. Genesis 7-1-3 records God's words. The Lord then said to Noah, Go into the ark, you and your whole family, because I have found you righteous in this generation. Take with you 7 pairs of every kind of clean animal, a male and its mate, and 1 pair of every kind of unclean animal, a male and its mate, and also 7 pairs of every kind of bird, male and female, to keep their various kinds alive throughout the earth. Now came one of the most amazing parts of the whole story. How do you get 2 of every animal on earth to come to one place? How do you convince lions and lambs, elephants and mice, birds and reptiles, to all walk peacefully into a boat. You don't have to convince them. God does it for you. Genesis 7-8-9 tells us, pairs of clean and unclean animals, of birds and of all creatures that move along the ground, male and female, came to Noah and entered the ark, as God had commanded. Noah. The animals came on their own. God called them, and they responded. Lions walked next to sheep, without attacking. Bears strolled alongside deer. Eagles flew next to sparrows. It was like the Garden of Eden all over again, with animals living in perfect harmony. Genesis 7:13-16 describes the final moments. On that very day, Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, together with his wife and the wives of his 3 sons, entered the ark. They had with them every wild animal according to its kind, all livestock according to their kinds, every creature that moves along the ground according to its kind, and every bird according to its kind, everything with wings. Pairs of all creatures that have the breath of life in them came to Noah and entered the ark. The animals going in were male and female of every living thing as God had commanded Noah. Then the Lord shut him in. Notice that last sentence, then the Lord shut him in. God himself closed the door of the ark. Once that door was shut, there was no going back. Everyone inside was safe, and everyone outside was about to face the flood. For 7 days after, everyone was safely inside the ark. Nothing happened. Can you imagine what those days were like? Noah and his family were locked inside this huge boat with thousands of animals, waiting for something they had never seen before. Rain. Then it began. Genesis 7:11-12 describes the moment when everything changed. In the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the 2nd month, on that day all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened, and rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. This wasn't just a heavy rainstorm. The springs of the great deep burst forth. Water came shooting up from underground. The floodgates of the heavens opened. Water poured down from above. It was like the whole world was being squeezed between 2 massive oceans. The rain didn't stop, day after day. Night after night, water kept falling. Genesis 7:17 tells us, for 40 days the flood kept coming on the earth. And as the waters increased, they lifted the ark high above the earth. At first, people outside probably thought it was just a bad storm. They might have run for shelter, expecting it to pass. But as the hours turned to days, and the days turned to weeks, they must have realized something terrible was happening. The water kept rising higher and higher. Genesis 7 hours, 19 minutes, and 20 seconds shows us how complete the destruction was. They rose greatly on the earth, and all the high mountains under the entire heavens were covered. The waters rose and covered the mountains to a depth of more than 15 cubits. Every mountain on earth was under water. Even the highest peaks disappeared beneath the flood. The whole world became one giant ocean, with only one boat floating on its surface. Genesis 7:21-23 describes the tragic result. Every living thing that moved on land perished. Birds, livestock, wild animals, all the creatures that swarm over the earth, and all mankind, everything on dry land that had the breath of life in its nostrils died. Every living thing on the face of the earth was wiped out. People and animals and the creatures that move along the ground and the birds were wiped from the earth. Only Noah was left, and those with him in the ark. It's hard to imagine such complete destruction. Every person who had laughed at Noah was gone. Every animal that hadn't made it to the ark was dead. Every plant, every tree, every living thing that needed air to breathe had drowned. The earth that God had created with such beauty and filled with such life was now a watery grave. Only 8 people remained alive in the entire world. Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their 3 wives. They floated alone on an endless sea, carrying in their ark the future of all life on earth. Living inside the ark must have been unlike anything anyone had ever experienced. Genesis 7:24 tells us that the waters flooded the earth for 150 days, but the rain itself fell for 40 days and nights. During those first 40 days, Noah and his family listened to the constant sound of rain pounding on the roof above them. Inside the ark, it was probably dark most of the time. The only light came through the opening that ran around the top. Just below the roof, the air was filled with the sounds and smells of thousands of animals. Lions roared, elephants trumpeted, birds chirped, and countless other creatures made their various noises. But something miraculous was happening inside that floating zoo. The animals weren't acting the way they normally would. Predators weren't hunting prey. Everything was peaceful, just like it had been when they all walked into the ark together. God was supernaturally keeping order among all these different creatures. Noah and his family had to work hard every day. The animals needed food and water. Waste had to be cleaned up. With thousands of creatures living in one space, there was always something that needed attention. They had to make sure the elephants had enough to eat, the birds had clean water, and the smaller animals weren't getting lost or hurt. Genesis doesn't give us many details about daily life in the ark, but we can imagine some of the challenges. How do you feed a lion without letting it hunt other animals? How do you keep thousands of different animals healthy in close quarters? How do you deal with the smell and noise of such a crowded space? Yet through it all, God was taking care of them. The ark was perfectly designed for its purpose. It was big enough to hold everything and everyone. It was strong enough to survive the worst storm in history. And it was sealed well enough to keep everyone inside safe and dry. Noah's family must have spent time praying and talking together. They were the only humans left alive, and they knew it. The responsibility they carried was enormous. When the flood ended, they would have to start the world over again. They also had to live with the knowledge of what was happening outside. Every day, as they cared for the animals and maintained their floating home, they knew that everything they had ever known was being destroyed. Every place they had ever visited, every person they had ever met, was gone forever. Yet they also had hope. God had saved them for a purpose. He had promised to establish his covenant with Noah. When the water went down, they would step out into a clean, fresh world and begin again. After 40 days, the rain finally stopped. But the ark didn't land immediately. Genesis 8:13 tells us what happened next. But God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and the livestock that were with him in the ark. And he sent a wind over the earth, and the waters receded. Now the springs of the deep and the floodgates of the heavens had been closed, and the rain from heaven had been restrained. The water receded steadily from the earth. God sent a wind to hack. God sent a wind to hack. Help dry up the water. Slowly, very slowly, the level began to go down. It had taken 40 days for the water to cover the earth, but it took much longer for it to go away. Genesis 8:24 records an important moment. On the 17th day of the 7th month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Finally, after months of floating, the ark touched solid ground again, but they still couldn't get out. The mountains were still mostly underwater. Noah wanted to know what was happening outside, so he decided to send out some birds to explore. Genesis 8:6-7 tells us, after 40 days, Noah opened a window he had made in the ark and sent out a raven, and it kept flying back and forth until the water had dried up from the earth. The raven could fly around and find places to perch, but it didn't bring back any news. So Noah tried a different bird. Genesis 88:9 describes what happened. Then he sent out a dove to see if the water had receded from the surface of the ground. But the dove could find nowhere to perch because there was water over all the surface of the earth. So it returned to Noah in the ark. He reached out his hand and took the dove and brought it back to himself in the ark. The dove was looking for dry land, but there wasn't any yet. Noah waited 7 more days and sent the dove out again. Genesis 8:10-11 tells us about this second trip. He waited 7 more days and again sent out the dove from the ark. When the dove returned to him in the evening, therein its beak was a freshly plucked olive leaf. Then Noah knew that the water had receded from the earth. An olive leaf, it was the first sign of new life, the first proof that plants were growing again somewhere on earth. Noah must have been so excited to see that little green leaf. It meant the world was coming back to life. Noah waited another 7 days and sent a dove out a third time. Genesis 8:12 records, he waited 7 more days and sent the dove out again, but this time it did not return to him. The dove had found a place to live. The earth was ready, but Noah was a patient man who waited for God's permission. Genesis 8 eti shows his careful obedience. By the first day of the first month of Noah's 601st year, the water had dried up from the earth. Noah then removed the covering from the ark and saw that the surface of the ground was dry. By the 27th day of the second month, the earth was completely dry. Finally, after more than a year in the ark, God gave Noah permission to leave. Genesis 8 hours, 15 minutes, and 16 seconds records God's words. Then God said to Noah, "Come out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons and their wives." When Noah and his family stepped out of the ark, they were looking at a completely different world. Genesis 18:19 describes the moment. So Noah came out together with his sons and his wife, and his sons' wives, all the animals and all the creatures that move along the ground and all the birds. Everything that moves on land came out of the ark, one kind after another. The first thing Noah did wasn't to build a house or plant a garden. Genesis 8:20 tells us. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and taking some of all the clean animals and clean birds, he sacrificed burnt offerings on it. Noah's first act in the new world was to worship God and thank him for salvation. This sacrifice was important. Noah took some of the clean animals. Remember, he had brought 7 pairs of these instead of just 2 and offered them to God. He was giving back to God some of the very animals that God had used to save his family. God was pleased with Noah's sacrifice. Genesis 8:21 records God's response. The Lord smelled the pleasing aroma and said in his heart, "Never again will I curse the ground because of humans, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood, and never again will I destroy all living creatures, as I have done." This was an amazing promise. Even though God knew that people would still sin, that every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood, he promised never again to destroy the world with a flood. He was giving humanity another chance. Genesis 8:22 contains one of the most comforting promises in the Bible. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease. God was promising that the basic rhythms of life would continue. There would always be seasons, always be day and night, always be time to plant and time to harvest. Then God gave Noah and his family some important instructions. Genesis 9:13 records his blessing. Then God blessed Noah and his sons, saying, "To them, be fruitful and increase in number, and fill the earth. The fear and dread of you will fall on all the beasts of the earth, and on all the birds in the sky, on every creature that moves along the ground, and on all the fish in the sea. They are given into your hands. Everything that lives and moves about will be food for you. Just as I gave you the green plants, I now give you everything." This was similar to what God had told Adam and Eve, but with some important differences. Now humans could eat meat, not just plants, and the animals would fear humans instead of living in perfect harmony with them like they had in Eden. But God also gave them an important rule about life. Genesis 9:4-6 records his command, "But you must not eat meat that has its lifeblood still in it. And for your lifeblood I will surely demand an accounting. I will demand an accounting from every animal. And from each human being, too, I will demand an accounting for the life of another human being. Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. For in the image of God, who sheds? For in the image of God, as God made mankind." God was making it clear that life was precious. Animal life had value. You couldn't just waste it. And human life was especially sacred, because people were made in God's image. Murder would be punished severely. Then God made a beautiful covenant with Noah and his family. Genesis 9:11-13 describes this promise. I establish my covenant with you. Never again will all life be destroyed by the waters of a flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, This is the sign of the covenant I am making between me and you, and every living creature with you, a covenant for all generations to come. I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. The rainbow became God's promise, written across the sky. Every time Noah and his descendants saw a rainbow after a storm, they would remember that God had promised never again to destroy the world with a flood. It was a sign of hope, a reminder that God keeps his promises. Genesis 9:14-16 explains the full meaning. Whenever I bring clouds over the earth and the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenant between me and you and all living creatures of every kind. Never again will the waters become a flood to destroy all life. Whenever the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and all living creatures of every kind on the earth. After all the drama of the flood, Noah settled down to normal life. Genesis 9:20 tells us, Noah, a man of the soil, proceeded to plant a vineyard. He became a farmer, growing grapes and making wine. It seems like a peaceful way to spend his later years. But then something happened that shows us that even righteous Noah was still a flawed human being. Genesis 9:21 records the incident. When he drank some of its wine, he became drunk and lay, uncovered inside his tent. Noah got drunk and passed out naked in his tent. This was embarrassing and shameful behavior, especially for the man who had been chosen by God to save the human race. It reminds us that even the best people can make serious mistakes. What happened next reveals the different characters of Noah's sons. Genesis 9:22-23 tells the story. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father naked and told his two brothers outside, but Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it across their shoulders. Then they walked in backward and covered their father's naked body. Their faces were turned the other way, so that they would not see their father naked. Ham saw his father's shame, and instead of quietly covering him up, he went and told his brothers about it. He seemed to find it amusing or entertaining, but Shem and Japheth acted with respect and love. They covered their father's nakedness without even looking at him, protecting his dignity even when he couldn't protect it himself. When Noah woke up and learned what had happened, his response was swift and serious. Genesis 9:24-27 records his words. When Noah awoke from his wine and found out what his youngest son had done to him, he said, Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves will he be to his brothers. He also said, Praise be to the Lord, the God of Shem. May Canaan be the slave of Shem. May God extend Japheth's territory. May Japheth live in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be the slave of Japheth. This curse on Canaan, Ham's son, and blessing on Shem and Japheth would have huge consequences for the future. The descendants of Shem would become the Jewish people through whom God would work to bless the world. The descendants of Japheth would spread out and become many nations, and the descendants of Canaan would face judgment for their ancestors' disrespectful behavior. Noah lived 350 years after the flood, reaching the impressive age of 950 years. Genesis 9:28-29 concludes his story. After the flood, Noah lived 350 years. Noah lived a total of 950 years, and then he died. As the years passed, Noah's sons and their wives had many children, and their children had children, and the human population began to grow again. Genesis 10:1 introduces this new chapter. This is the account of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's sons, who themselves had sons after the flood. Genesis chapter 10 gives us what scholars call the Table of Nations, a list of all the different peoples who descended from Noah's 3 sons. From Shem came the Semitic peoples, including eventually Abraham and the Jewish nation. From Ham came various African and Middle Eastern peoples. From Japheth came many of the peoples who would spread across Europe and Asia. But at first, everyone stayed together in one place. Genesis 11:1-2 tells us, "Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there." Having one language meant everyone could understand each other perfectly. There were no communication barriers, no cultural misunderstandings. They all worked together as one big human family. But instead of spreading out across the earth as God had commanded them to do, they decided to stay together and build something impressive. Genesis 11:3-4 records their plan. They said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." This tower wasn't just about architecture. It was about pride and rebellion. They wanted to make a name for themselves instead of honoring God's name. They were to stay together instead of filling the earth as God had commanded. They were trying to reach heaven through their own efforts instead of depending on God. God saw what they were doing, and he knew where it would lead. Genesis 11:56 shows his concern. "But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. The Lord said, 'If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them.'" When people work together in rebellion against God, there's no limit to the evil they can accomplish. God had seen this before the flood, and he wasn't going to let it happen again. So God did something that completely stopped their project. Genesis 11:7-8 describes his action. "Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so they will not understand each other." So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. Suddenly the construction workers couldn't understand each other. The architects couldn't explain their plans. Families couldn't communicate with their neighbors. Confusion and frustration replaced cooperation and progress. Genesis 11:9 explains the result. That is why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. The word Babel sounds like the Hebrew word for confused. What had started as a proud human achievement became a symbol of confusion and failure. The tower was never finished, and the people were forced to spread out across the world, forming different nations with different languages. This scattering wasn't just punishment. It was also protection. By dividing humanity into smaller groups with different languages, God was preventing them from uniting in rebellion against him again. He was also fulfilling his original command to ill the earth even though they had tried to resist it. Story of Babel shows us that human pride and rebellion will always fail in the end. People may try to build their own way to heaven, make their own names great, and resist God's plans, but God's purposes will ultimately be accomplished. The earth would be filled with people just as he had always intended, even if it happened through judgment rather than obedience. After the confusion that Babel scattered people across the earth, most of humanity forgot about the one true God. They began worshipping idols made of wood and stone, serving false gods that couldn't see or hear or help them. But God hadn't forgotten his plan to bless the world through a special family. In the city of Ur of the Chaldeans, there lived a man named Abram. His father was Terah, and he had 2 brothers, Nahor and Haran. Genesis 11:27, 7:28 tells us about their family. This is the account of Terah's family line. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran became the father of Lot. While his father Terah was still alive, Haran died in Ur of the Chaldeans, in the land of his birth. It was a wealthy, sophisticated city with impressive buildings and advanced technology. The people there worshipped the moon god and other false deities. Abram grew up surrounded by idol worship, just like everyone else in his culture. His family probably had their own household gods that they prayed to and served. But then something incredible happened. The true God, the creator of heaven and earth, spoke directly to Abram. Genesis 121-3 records this life-changing moment. The Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household, to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." Think about what God was asking Abram to do. Leave everything familiar, his country, his extended family, his father's house. Go to a place God hadn't even named yet. Trust completely in promises that seemed impossible. Abram was 75 years old, and his wife, Sarai, was barren. How could he become a great nation when he didn't even have children? But Abram believed God. Genesis 12-4-5 shows his immediate obedience. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. Notice that Abram had already started this journey. His father, Terah, had begun moving the family toward Canaan, but had stopped in Haran, where he died. Now God was calling Abram to finish what his father had started. The journey from Haran to Canaan was long and dangerous. There were no maps, no hotels, no gas stations. They traveled with their flocks and herds, their servants and belongings, moving slowly across unfamiliar territory. They had to find water for their animals, grass for grazing, and safe places to camp each night. When they finally reached Canaan, Genesis 126-7 tells us what happened. Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. This was the first time God specifically identified the promised land. He pointed to Canaan and said, "This is it. This is where your descendants will live." But there was a problem. The Canaanites alleged. Why lived there? The land was already occupied by other people. How could God give it to Abram's offspring? Abram didn't argue or complain. He built an altar and worshipped God, trusting that somehow, some way God would keep his promise. This act of worship was also a public declaration. Anyone who saw that altar knew that Abram served the Lord, not the local gods. As Abram continued living in Canaan, God spoke to him again with even more specific promises. Genesis 13:14-17 records this conversation. The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had parted from him, "Look around from where you are, to the north and south, to the east and west. All the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. Go walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you." God told Abram to look in every direction, north, south, east, west. Everything he could see would belong to his descendants, and those descendants would be countless, like dust particles that no one could number. This was an amazing promise for a man who still had no children. But Abram was getting older, and he began to worry about how God's promises could come true. Genesis 15:1-3 shows his honest concern. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward." But Abram said, "Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eleazar of Damascus?" And Abram said, "You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir." Abram was being practical. According to the customs of his time, if a man had no sons, his chief servant would inherit everything. Abram's servant, Eleazar, was a good man, but he wasn't the child God had promised. God's response was immediate and clear. Genesis 15:45 records his words. Then the word of the Lord came to him. This man will not be your heir, but a son, who is your own flesh and blood, will be your heir. He took him outside and said, Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. Standing under the star-filled sky, Abram heard God promise that his own biological son would be his heir, and that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars. Genesis 15:6 tells us Abram's response. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. This verse is incredibly important. Abram wasn't made right with God because of his good works or religious ceremonies. He was declared righteous simply because he believed God's promise. His faith, not his actions, made him acceptable to God. But God wasn't finished. He wanted to make a formal covenant with Abram, so he told him to prepare a special ceremony. Genesis 15:9, 1:0 describes the preparation. So the Lord said to him, Bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abram brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. This was how covenants were made in ancient times. Both parties would walk between the pieces of sacrificed animals, essentially saying, May I be torn apart like these animals if I break this agreement. But something amazing happened in this ceremony. Genesis 15 hours, 12 minutes and 17 seconds to 18 tells us, as the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, To your descendant I give this land from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river the Euphrates. Only God passed between the pieces. Abram was asleep. This meant God was taking full responsibility for keeping the covenant. He was saying, Even if Abram fails, even if his descendants fail, I will keep my promises. The smoking firepot and blazing torch represented God's presence, and he alone walked through the sacrifice. Later, God would make this covenant even more personal. Genesis 17:35 records another conversation. Abram fell face down, and God said to him, As for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations. God changed Abram's name to Abraham. Abram meant exalted father, but Abraham meant father of many nations. Every time someone called his name, Abraham would be reminded of God's promise. He would be the father not just of one nation, but of many nations. Years passed, and Abraham still had no children. Sarah, whose name had also been changed from Sarai, was well past childbearing age. She began to doubt that God's promise would come through her. So she came up with her own plan. Genesis 16:12 tells us about Sarah's idea. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her. Abram agreed to what Sarai said. This was a common practice in their culture. If the wife couldn't have children, she could give her servant to her husband, and any children born would legally belong to the wife. Sarah thought this might be how God intended to fulfill his promise, but this plan created huge problems. Genesis 16:45 describes what happened. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." Hagar became proud and disrespectful towards Sarah once she was pregnant. Sarah became jealous and angry. Abraham found himself caught in the middle of a conflict between his wife and the mother of his child. Abraham's response wasn't very helpful. Genesis 16:6 records his words, "Your slave is in your hands." Abram said, "Do with her whatever you think best." Sarah treated Hagar so harshly that she ran away into the desert, but God cared about Hagar even though she was just a servant. Genesis 16:7, 1:1 tells us about God's intervention. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?" "I'm running away from my mistress Sarai," she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her." The angel added, "I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "You are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery." God promised Hagar that her son would also become the father of a great nation. The name Ishmael meant God hears, because God had heard Hagar's cry for help in her distress. Genesis 16:15-16 concludes this part of the story. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she had born. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. Abraham finally had a son, but this wasn't the son God had promised. Ishmael was born through human planning and effort, not three. Oh, God's miraculous power! Abraham loved Ishmael, and probably thought this was how God intended to fulfill his promise. But God had a different plan. 13 years passed after Ishmael's birth. Abraham was now 99 years old, and Sarah was 89. By any human standard, it was impossible for them to have children. But God appeared to Abraham again with an amazing announcement. Genesis 17:15-16 records God's words. God also said to Abraham, "As for Sarai, your wife, you are no longer to call her Sarai. Her name will be Sarah. I will bless her and will surely give you a son by her. I will bless her so that she will be the mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her." Abraham's reaction shows how impossible this seemed. Genesis 17:17 tells us Abraham fell face down. He laughed and said to himself, "Will a son be born to a man 100 red years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? Abraham laughed not from joy, but from disbelief. The idea seemed so ridiculous that he couldn't help but laugh. He even suggested to God that Ishmael could be the promised son, but God was clear about his plan. Genesis 17:19 records his response. Then God said, "Yes, but your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant with him, as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him." The name Isaac meant laughter, which was perfect considering both Abraham and Sarah's reactions to God's promise. Later, when 3 visitors came to Abraham's tent, they repeated this promise. Genesis 18:10 tells us, "Then one of them said, 'I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son.'" Now Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent which was behind him. Sarah's reaction was just like her husband's. Genesis 18:12-13 records. So Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure?" Then the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Will I really have a child now that I'm old?'" When confronted about her laughter, Sarah was afraid and denied it, but the visitor knew she had laughed. Genesis 18:14 contains one of the most powerful questions in the Bible. Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son." Exactly as God had promised, Sarah became pregnant. Genesis 21:1-3 describes the miracle. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah, as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. Isaac's birth was completely miraculous. Sarah was far too old to have children naturally. This baby was born entirely through God's power, proving that nothing is impossible with God. Genesis 216:7 shows Sarah's joy. Sarah said, "God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me." And she added, "Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age." The laughter that had once expressed doubt and disbelief now expressed pure joy and amazement. God had done the impossible, and Sarah couldn't contain her happiness. Isaac grew up as the beloved son of promise. He was everything Abraham had hoped for and more. But then God asked Abraham to do something that seemed to contradict everything he had promised. Genesis 22:1-2 records this shocking command. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham, here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain. I will show you." This was the ultimate test of Abraham's faith. God was asking him to sacrifice the very son through whom all the promises were supposed to be fulfilled. If Isaac died, how could he become the father of many nations? How could Abraham's descendants be as numerous as the stars? But notice how God described Isaac. "Your son, your only son, whom you love." God knew how much Isaac meant to Abraham. This wasn't a casual request. It was asking Abraham to give up the most precious thing in his life. Abraham's response is incredible. Genesis 22:3 simply says, "Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about." Abraham didn't argue or delay. He got up early the next morning and prepared to obey God, even though it meant sacrificing his beloved son. This shows the depth of his faith and trust in God. The journey to Mount Moriah took 3 days. Can you imagine what those 3 days were like for Abraham? Every step took him closer to the moment when he would have to sacrifice Isaac. Every conversation with his son must have been painful, knowing what lay ahead. When they reached the mountain, Abraham made his preparations. Genesis 226:8 describes the scene. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father, Abraham, "Father, yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together. Isaac's innocent question must have broken Abraham's heart, but Abraham's answer showed his faith. God himself will provide. He believed that somehow, some way, God would work everything out. At the top of the mountain, Abraham built an altar and arranged the wood. Then came the hardest moment of all. Genesis 2:9. 1:0 tells us when they reached the place God had told him about. Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to sacrifice his son. Abraham was actually going to do it. He had tied up Isaac and placed him on the altar. He raised the knife, ready to plunge it into his son's heart. This wasn't just a show of faith. Abraham was completely committed to obeying God, no matter how much it cost him. But at the last possible second, God intervened. Genesis 22:11-12 records the dramatic rescue. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham, here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." God stopped Abraham just in time. This had been a test, and Abraham had passed with flying colors. He had proven that he loved and trusted God more than anything else in the world, even his beloved son. Genesis 22:13 shows God's provision. Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. God had provided a substitute, just as Abraham had said he would. The ram died instead of Isaac, showing God's mercy and provision because of Abraham's incredible faith. God renewed his promises with even stronger language. Genesis 22:16-18 records God's oath. "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this, and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me." After the dramatic events at Mount Moriah, life returned to normal for Abraham's family. But as the years passed, Sarah grew old and eventually died. Genesis 23:12 records this sad moment. Sarah lived to be 127 years old. She died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan, and Abraham went to mourn for Sarah and to weep over her. Sarah had lived an incredible life. She had seen God's miraculous power when Isaac was born. She had watched her son grow up strong and healthy. She had been part of God's great plan to bless all nations through Abraham's family. But now Abraham faced a practical problem. He needed a place to bury his wife, but he was still a foreigner in Canaan. He didn't own any land except what God had promised him, and that promise was for the future, not the present. Genesis 23:34 shows Abraham's request to the local people. Then Abraham rose from beside his dead wife and spoke to the Hittites. He said, "I am a foreigner and stranger among you. Sell me some property for a burial site here, so I can bury my dead." The Hittites respected Abraham and offered to give him any burial site he wanted, but Abraham insisted on paying full price for a field that contained a cave. Genesis 23:17 describes the transaction. So Ephron's field in Machpelah near Mamre, both the field and the cave in it, and all the trees within the borders of the field was deed to Abraham as his property in the presence of all the Hittites who had come to the gate of the city. This cave became the family burial place. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and their wives would all be buried there. It was the first piece of the promised land that Abraham actually owned. After Sarah's death, Abraham realized he needed to find a wife for Isaac, but he didn't want Isaac to marry one of the local Canaanite women who worshipped false gods. Genesis 2:4 shows Abraham's concern. Abraham was now very old, and the Lord had blessed him in every way. He said to the sea, nigh a servant in his household, the one in charge of all that he had, "Put your hand under my thigh. I want you to swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of the earth, that you will not get a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I am living, but will go to my country and my own relatives, and get a wife for my son Isaac." Abraham sent his trusted servant on a long journey back to Mesopotamia, where his relatives still lived. The servant took 10 camels, loaded with gifts, and set out to find the right woman for Isaac. When the servant reached the city where Abraham's relatives lived, he prayed for God's guidance. Genesis 24:12-14 records his prayer. Then he prayed, "Lord God of my master Abraham, make me successful today, and show kindness to my master Abraham. See, I am standing beside this spring, and the daughters of the townspeople are coming out to draw water. May it be that when I say to a young woman, 'Please let down your jar that I may have a drink,' and she says, 'Drink, and I'll water your camels too,' let her be the one you have chosen for your servant Isaac." Before he had even finished praying, a beautiful young woman named Rebekah came to the well. Genesis 24:18-20 describes what happened. She said, "Drink, my lord," and quickly lowered the jar to her hands and gave him a drink. After she had given him a drink, she said, "I'll draw water for your camels too, until they have had enough to drink." So she quickly emptied her jar into the trough, ran back to the well to draw more water, and drew enough for all his camels. This was exactly what the servant had prayed for. Rebekah not only gave him water, but also volunteered to water all 10 camels, a huge job that showed her kind and generous heart. When the servant learned that Rebekah was Abraham's great niece, he knew God had answered his prayer. After explaining his mission to her family and receiving their permission, Rebekah agreed to return with him to marry Isaac. Genesis 24. 6267 describes their first meeting. Now Isaac had come from Beer-lahai-roi, for he was living in the Negev. He went out to the field one evening to meditate, and as he looked up he saw camels approaching. Rebekah also looked up and saw Isaac. She got down from her camel and asked the servant, "Who is that man in the field coming to meet us?" "He is my master," the servant answered. So she took her veil and covered herself. Then the servant told Isaac all he had done. Isaac brought her into the tent of his mother Sarah, and he married Rebekah. So she became his wife, and he loved her, and Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. Isaac and Rebekah were happy together, but for many years they had no children. Like his father before him, Isaac had to wait and trust God's timing. Genesis 25:201 tells us, Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel, the Aryan from Padan Aram, and sister of Laban the Aramean. Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was childless. The Lord answered his prayer, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. But this pregnancy was different from most. Genesis 25:22 describes Rebekah's unusual experience. The babies jostled each other within her, and she said, "Why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. The babies were fighting inside the womb. This troubled Rebekah so much that she went to ask God what was happening. God's answer was startling. Genesis 25:23 records his prophecy. The Lord said to her, "2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger." God was telling Rebekah that her twins would become the fathers of 2 different nations, and that these nations would always be in conflict. Even more surprising, the younger son would become greater than the older son, the opposite of what usually happened in those days. When the twins were born, they were as different as could be. Genesis 25:24-26 describes their birth. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. The first to come out was red, and his whole body was like a hairy garment, so they named him Esau. After this, his brother came out with his hand grasping Esau's heel, so he was named Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah gave birth to them. Esau came out first, covered with red hair. His name meant hairy. Jacob came out holding onto Esau's heel as if he was trying to pull his brother back and be born first himself. Jacob meant heel grabber or suppler, someone who takes another person's place. As the boys grew up, their differences became even more obvious. Genesis 2:5-7:28 tells us, "The boys grew up, and Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the open country, while Jacob was content to stay at home among the tents. Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Esau was an outdoorsman who loved hunting and adventure. Jacob preferred staying home and was probably more intellectual and thoughtful. Unfortunately, Their parents each had a favored son, which created tension in the family. This favoritism led to a shocking incident that would change everything. Genesis 25:29, 34 records what happened. Once when Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau came in from the open country famished. He said to Jacob, "Quick, let me have some of that red stew. I'm famished." Jacob replied, "First, sell me your birthright." "Look, I am about to die," Esau said. "What good is the birthright to me?" But Jacob said, "Swear to me first." So he swore an oath to him, selling his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau some bread and some lentil stew. He ate and drank, and then got up and left. So Esau despised his birthright. The birthright was incredibly valuable. As the firstborn, Esau was entitled to a double portion of his father's inheritance and would become the head of the family after Isaac died. But when he was hungry and tired from hunting, he traded it all away for a bowl of stew. This shows us the different values of the two brothers. Esau lived for the moment and didn't think about the future. Jacob understood the importance of spiritual things and was willing to plan and scheme to get them. Years passed and Isaac grew old and blind. According to custom, it was time for him to give his special blessing to his firstborn son. This blessing was more than just nice words. It was believed to have real power and would determine the future of both sons. Genesis 27:14 describes Isaac's plan. When Isaac was old and his eyes were so weak that he could no longer see, he called for Esau, his older son, and said to him, "My son, here I am," he answered. Isaac said, "I am now an old man and don't know the day of my death. Now then, get your equipment, your quiver, and bow and go out to the open country to hunt some wild game for me. Prepare me the kind of tasty food I like and bring it to me to eat, so that I may give you my blessing before I die." Isaac wanted to eat his favorite meal before giving Esau the blessing, but Rebekah overheard this conversation, and she had other plans. Genesis 2:7-6, 10 shows her scheme. Rebekah said to her son Jacob, "Look, I overheard your father say to your brother Esau, 'Bring me some game and prepare me some tasty food to eat, so that I may give you my blessing in the presence of the Lord before I die.' Now, my son, listen carefully and do what I tell you. Go out to the flock and bring me 2 choice young goats, so I can prepare some tasty food for your fath, just the way he likes it. Then take it to your father to eat, so that he may give you his blessing before he dies." Rebekah remembered God's prophecy that the older would serve the younger. She believed Jacob was supposed to receive the blessing, and she was willing to use deception to make sure it happened. Jacob was worried about getting caught. Genesis 27:11-12 shows his concern. Jacob said to Rebekah, his mother, "But my brother, Esau, is a hairy man while I have smooth skin. What if my father touches me? I would appear to be tricking him and would bring down a curse on myself rather than a blessing." But Rebekah had thought of everything. She put goat skins on Jacob's hands and neck to make them feel hairy like Esau's. She dressed him in Esau's clothes so he would smell like his brother. Then she prepared the meal and sent Jacob to his father. The deception worked but barely. Genesis 27:21-23 describes the tense moment. Then Isaac said to Jacob, "Come near so I can touch you, my son, to know whether you really are my son, Esau, or not." Jacob went close to his father Isaac, who touched him and said, "The voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau." He did not recognize him, for his hands were hairy like those of his brother, Esau. So he blessed him. Isaac was suspicious because Jacob's voice sounded wrong, but the hairy hands convinced him. Genesis 27:27-29 records the blessing. So he came near and kissed him. When Isaac caught the smell of his clothes, he blessed him and said, "Ah, the smell of my son is like the smell of a field that the Lord has blessed. May God give you heaven's dew and earth's richness, an abundance of grain and new wine. May nations serve you and peoples bow down to you. Be lord over your brothers, and may the sons of your mother bow down to you. May those who curse you be cursed, and those who bless you be blessed, and those who bless you be blessed. Jacob had received the blessing meant for the firstborn, but almost immediately disaster struck. Genesis 27:30-32 tells us, after Isaac finished blessing him, and Jacob had scarcely left his father's presence, his brother Esau came in from hunting. He too prepared some tasty food and brought it to his father. Then he said to him, "My father, please sit up and eat some of my game, so that you may give me your blessing." His father Isaac asked him, "Who are you?" "I am your son," he answered. "Your firstborn, Esau." The truth came out immediately. Isaac realized he had been tricked, and Esau discovered that his blessing had been stolen. Genesis 27:34 shows Esau's anguish. When Esau heard his father's words, he burst out with a loud and bitter cry and said to his father, "Bless me. Me too, my father." But it was too late. In those days, a blessing couldn't be taken back once it was given. Isaac could give Esau another blessing, but the most important one was gone forever. Esau was furious and began planning his revenge. Genesis 27:41 records his intention. Esau held a grudge against Jacob because of the blessing his father had given him. He said to himself, "The days of mourning for my father are near. Then I will kill my brother Jacob." Esau was planning to wait until Isaac died, then murder Jacob. When Rebekah heard about this threat, she knew Jacob had to leave immediately. Genesis 27:42-43 shows her urgent warning. When Rebekah was told what her older son Esau had said, she sent for her younger son Jacob and said to him, "Your brother Esau is planning to avenge himself by killing you. Now then, my son, do what I say. Flee at once to my brother Laban in Haran." But Rebekah was clever. Instead of just telling Isaac that Jacob was running for his life, she gave a different reason for the journey. Genesis 27:46 records her complaint. Then Rebekah said to Isaac, "I know disgusted with living because of these Hittite women. If Jacob takes a wife from among the women of this land, from Hittite women like these, my life will not be worth living." This was a smart approach. Isaac was already concerned about Jacob marrying local women who didn't worship God, just as Abraham had been concerned about Isaac's marriage. So Isaac called Jacob and gave him instructions for the journey. Genesis 28:14 records Isaac's blessing and command. So Isaac called for Jacob and blessed him. Then he commanded him, "Do not marry a Canaanite woman. Go at once to Paddan Aram, to the house of your mother's father Bethuel. Take a wife for yourself there from among the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother. May God Almighty bless you, and make you fruitful and increase your numbers until you become a community of peoples. May he give you and your descendants the blessing given to Abraham, so that you may take possession of the land where you now reside as a foreigner, the land God gave to Abraham." Isaac was passing on the covenant promises to Jacob. Despite the deception involved in getting the blessing, Isaac recognized that God's plan was for Jacob to carry on the family line and inherit the promises made to Abraham. So Jacob left home, fleeing from his angry brother and heading toward an uncertain future in a foreign land. He had gotten what he wanted, the birthright and the blessing. But now he had to pay the price. He was leaving behind everything familiar and didn't know if he would ever see his family again. Jacob left his family home with nothing but the clothes on his back and his father's blessing. He was running for his life, heading toward Haran, where his uncle Laban lived hundreds of miles away. As he walked alone across the wilderness, he must have wondered if he had made the right choices. He had the blessing he wanted, but at what cost? On his first night away from home, something incredible happened. Genesis 28:10-11 tells us, Jacob left Beersah and set out for Haran. When he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night, because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head and lay down to sleep. Jacob was completely alone in the wilderness, using a rock for a pillow. He had no tent, no servants, no comfort, just the hard ground and the night sky above him. He must have felt abandoned and afraid, wondering what the future held. But God met him in that lonely place. Genesis 28:12-15 describes the amazing dream. He had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth, with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. There above it stood the Lord, and he said, "I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you." What a sight that must have been! A stairway stretching from earth to heaven, with angels constantly moving up and down, and at the top, God himself speaking words of promise and comfort to this frightened young man. God was confirming that despite Jacob's deception, the covenant promises made to Abraham and Isaac now belonged to him. The land would be his descendants would be countless, all nations would be blessed through his family, and most importantly, God would be with him wherever he went. When Jacob woke up, he was overwhelmed by what had happened. Genesis 28:16-17 shows his reaction. When Jacob awoke from his sleep, he thought, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it." He was afraid and said, "How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven." Jacob realized he had been in God's presence without knowing it. The place that had seemed so ordinary and lonely was actually sacred ground. God wasn't just in temples or holy places. He was everywhere, even in the wilderness. Genesis 28:18-19 describes what Jacob did next. Early the next morning, Jacob took the stone he had placed under his head and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on top of it. He called that place Bethel, though the city used to be called Elis. Jacob turned his stone pillar into a monument, marking the place where God had spoken to him. Bethel meant house of God. This simple stone pillar would remind him forever of the night when God promised to be with him. But Jacob wanted to make sure God would keep his promises. Genesis 28:20-22 records his vow. Then Jacob made a vow saying, "If God will be with me and will watch over me on this journey I am taking, and will give me food to eat and clothes to wear, so that I return safely to my father's household, then the Lord will be my God, and this stone that I have set up as a pillar will be God's house. And of all that you give me, I will give you a tenth." Jacob was making a deal with God. If God would take care of him and bring him home safely, then Jacob would serve him and give him a tenth of everything he received. This shows that Jacob still had a lot to learn about faith and trust. He was treating God like a business partner instead of the sovereign Lord of the universe. Encouraged by God's promise, Jacob continued his journey toward Haran. When he finally arrived in the region where his mother's family lived, he stopped at a well where shepherds aided their flocks. Genesis 29:23 describes the scene. There he saw a well in the open country, with 3 flocks of sheep lying near it, because the flocks were watered from that well. The stone over the mouth of the well was large. When all the flocks were gathered, there the shepherds would roll the stone away from the well's mouth and water the sheep. Then they would return the stone to its place over the mouth of the well. Jacob asked the shepherds if they knew Laban, and they told him that Laban's daughter Rachel was coming with her sheep. Genesis 29:9, 1:1 describes their first meeting. While he was still talking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherd. When Jacob saw Rachel, daughter of his uncle Laban, and Laban's sheep, He went over and rolled the stone away from the mouth of the well and watered his uncle's sheep. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and began to weep aloud. Jacob was so excited to meet his cousin that he single-handedly moved the heavy stone that normally required several men to move. He was showing off his strength and probably trying to impress this beautiful young woman. When he told Rachel who he was, she ran to tell her. Father Laban welcomed Jacob warmly and invited him to stay. Genesis 29:14 records Laban's words. Then Laban said to him, "You are my own flesh and blood," and Jacob stayed with him for a whole month. During that month, Jacob worked hard for Laban, helping with the flocks and other tasks. Laban was impressed with Jacob's work ethic and wanted to formalize their arrangement. Genesis 29:15 shows Laban's offer. Laban said to Jacob, "Because you are a relative of mine, should you work for me for nothing? Tell me what your wages should be." This is where things get interesting. Laban had 2 daughters, Leah, the older, and Rachel, the younger one. Genesis 29:16-17 describes them. Now, Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah had weak eyes, but Rachel was lovely in form and beautiful. Jacob had fallen in love with Rachel at first sight. Genesis 29:18 records his proposal to Laban. Jacob was in love with Rachel and said, "I'll work for you 7 years in return for your younger daughter, Rachel." 7 years was an incredibly long time to work just to marry someone. Most people paid money for a bride, but Jacob had arrived with nothing. He was willing to give 7 years of his life for the woman he loved. Laban agreed to the arrangement, and Jacob began his long period of service. Genesis 29:20 shows how love made the time pass quickly. So Jacob served 7 years to get Rachel, but they seemed like only a few days to him because of his love for her. When the 7 years were up, Jacob was ready to claim his bride. Genesis 29:21 shows his eagerness. Then Jacob said to Laban, "Give me my wife. My time is completed, and I want to make love to her." Laban prepared a wedding feast and invited everyone in the area to celebrate, but he had a trick planned that would change everything. On the wedding night, something terrible happened. Genesis 29:23-25 describes the deception. But when evening came, he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and Jacob made love to her. And Laban gave his servant Zilpah to his daughter as her attendant. When morning came, there was woe. So Jacob said to Laban, "What is this you have done to me? I served you for Rachel, didn't I? Why have you deceived me?" Jacob had been tricked. In the darkness and confusion of the wedding night, Laban had substituted Leah for Rachel. Jacob, who had deceived his own father to steal his brother's blessing, now found himself the victim of deception. Laban's excuse reveals the local custom. Genesis 29:26 records his explanation. Laban replied, "It is not our custom here to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older one." This was probably true, but Laban should have mentioned this important detail 7 years earlier when Jacob asked for Rachel. Instead, he had let Jacob work for 7 years under false pretenses, but Laban had a solution that would benefit him even more. Genesis 29:27-28 shows his proposal. "Finish this daughter's bridal week. Then we will give you the younger one also in return for another 7 years of work." So Jacob did so. He finished the week with Leah, and then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel to be his wife. Jacob now had 2 wives, something that would create enormous problems for the rest of his life. He had to work another 7 years for Rachel, meaning he would spend 14 years total just to marry the woman he loved. The family dynamics were difficult from the beginning. Genesis 29:3031 describes the situation. Jacob made love to Rachel also, and his love for Rachel was greater than his love for Leah, and he worked for Laban another 7 years. When the Lord saw that Leah was not loved, He enabled her to conceive, but Rachel remained childless. Jacob clearly favored Rachel over Leah. Everyone could see that Leah was unloved and unwanted, but God saw Leah's pain and gave her something. Her sister didn't have children. Leah's first 4 sons came quickly, and each birth reflected her desperate hope that her husband would finally love her. Genesis 29:32-35 records their births. Leah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Reuben, for she said, "It is because the Lord has seen my misery. Surely my husband will love me now." She conceived again, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, "Because the Lord heard that I am not loved, he gave me this one, too." She named him Simeon. Again she conceived, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, "Now at last my husband will become attached. O me, because I have borne him 3 sons." So he was named Levi. She conceived again, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, "This time I will praise the Lord." So she named him Judah. Then she stopped having children. Each name told the story of Leah's heartbreak. Reuben meant see a son. Surely Jacob would love her now that she had given him a son. Simeon meant one who hears. God had heard that she was unloved. Levi meant attached. Now Jacob would be attached to her. Finally, with Judah, whose name meant praise, Leah seemed to find some peace by focusing on praising God instead of trying to win her husband's love. Meanwhile, Rachel remained barren and her jealousy grew unbearable. Genesis 31 shows her desperation. When Rachel saw that she was not bearing Jacob any children, she became jealous of her sister. So she said to Jacob, "Give me children or I'll die." Rachel's demand made Jacob angry. Genesis 32 records his response. Jacob became angry with her and said, "Am I in the place of God who has kept you from having children?" Unable to have children herself, Rachel decided to follow the same plan that Sarah had used with Hagar. Genesis 33-4 describes her solution. Then she said, "Here's Bilhah, my servant. Sleep with her so that she can bear children for me, and I too can build a family through her." So she gave him her servant Bilhah as a wife. Jacob slept with her. Bilhah became pregnant and gave birth to 2 sons. Genesis 35-8 tells us, Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. Then Rachel said, "God has vindicated me. He has listened to my plea and given me a son." Because of this, she named him Dan. Rachel's servant Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a 2nd son. Then Rachel said, "I have had a great struggle with my sister, and I have won." So she named him Nali. Dan meant judge or vindicate. Rachel felt God had judged in her favor. Napali meant struggle. Rachel felt she was finally winning her competition with Leah, but Leah wasn't about to be outdone. When she saw that she had stopped having children, she decided to use her servant too. Genesis 30-9. 1:1 describes her response. When Leah saw that she had stopped having children, she took her servant Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a son. Then Leah said, "What good fortune." So she named him Gad. Zilpah also had a 2nd son. Genesis 3012:13 tells us, Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a 2nd son. Then Leah said, "How happy I am! The women will call me happy." So she named him Asher. Gad meant good fortune, and Asher meant happy. Leah was trying to present herself as blessed and joyful, even though she was still unloved. The rivalry between the sisters reached a bizarre climax over some mandrake's plants believed to help with fertility. Genesis 30:14-16 describes the incident. During wheat harvest, Reuben went out into the fields and found some mandrake plants which he brought to his mother Leah. Rachel said to Leah, "Please give me some of your son's mandrakes." But she said to her, "Wasn't it enough that you took away my husband? Will you take my son's mandrakes too?" "Very well," Rachel said. "He can sleep with you tonight in return for your son's mandrakes." The sisters were literally bargaining over who would get to sleep with their shared husband. This shows how dysfunctional their family had become because of polygamy and favoritism. That night Leah conceived again and had 2 more sons and a daughter. Genesis 30:17-21 records these births. God listened to Leah, and she became pregnant and bore Jacob a 5th son. Then Leah said, "God has rewarded me for giving my servant to my husband." So she named him Issachar. Leah conceived again and bore Jacob a 6th son. Then Leah said, "God has presented me with a precious gift. This time my husband will treat me with honor, because I have borne him 6 sons." So she named him Zebulun. Sometime later she gave birth to a daughter and named her Dinah. Issachar meant reward and Zebulun meant honor. Even after all this time, Leah was still hoping Jacob would finally honor and respect her. Finally, God remembered Rachel's longing for children. Genesis 30:22-24 describes the answered prayer. Then God remembered Rachel. He listened to her and enabled her to conceive. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son and said, "God has taken away my disgrace." She named him Joseph, saying, "May the Lord add to me another son." Joseph meant, "May he add." Rachel was so happy to finally have a son, but she immediately wanted another one. This son, born to Jacob's beloved wife, would become his favorite child, setting up more family conflict in the future. Jacob now had 11 sons and 1 daughter from 4 different women. The 12 sons would eventually become the 12 tribes of Israel, but their births were marked by jealousy, competition, and family dysfunction. After Joseph was born, Jacob began thinking about returning home. He had fulfilled his obligation to Laban and wanted to take his large family back to the land God had promised him. Genesis 30:25-26 shows his request. After Rachel gave birth to Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, "Send me on my way so I can go back to my own homeland. Send me on my way so I can go back to my own homeland. Give me my wives and children for whom I have served you, and I will be on my way. You know how much work I've done for you." But Laban didn't want to lose Jacob. The man had brought prosperity to everything he touched, and Laban had become wealthy because of Jacob's hard work. Genesis 30:27 records Laban's plea. But Laban said to him, "If I have found favor in your eyes, please stay. I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you." Jacob agreed to stay longer, but hey, he negotiated a deal that would allow him to build his own wealth. Genesis 30:132 describes the arrangement. "What shall I give you?" he asked. "Don't give me anything," Jacob replied. "But if you will do this one thing for me, I will go on tending your flocks. Let me go through all your flocks today and remove from them every speckled or spotted sheep, every dark-coaled lamb, and every spotted or speckled goat. They will be my wages." This seemed like a good deal for Laban since most animals were solid-colored. But Jacob had a plan. Using his knowledge of animal breeding, he managed to produce many speckled and spotted animals. Genesis 30:43 tells us the result. In this way, the man grew exceedingly prosperous and came to own large flocks, and female and male servants and camels and donkeys. Laban's sons began to complain that Jacob was getting too wealthy at their expense. Genesis 31:12 describes the growing tension. Jacob heard that Laban's sons were saying, "Jacob has taken everything our father owned and has gained all this wealth from what belonged to our father." And Jacob noticed that Laban's attitude toward him was not what it had been. Then God told Jacob it was time to leave. Genesis 3:13 records God's command. Then the Lord said to Jacob, "Go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you." Jacob decided to leave secretly while Laban was away, shearing sheep. Genesis 31:17-18 describes their escape. Then Jacob put his children and his wives on camels, and he drove all his livestock ahead of him, along with all the goods he had accumulated in Padam, to go to his father Isaac in the land of Canaan. They had been traveling for 3 days when Laban discovered they were gone. He pursued them with his relatives, angry and ready for a confrontation. But God warned Laban in a dream not to harm Jacob. When Laban caught up with them, he accused Jacob of stealing away secretly and taking his daughters like captives. But Jacob defended himself, reminding Laban of 20 years of faithful service. Genesis 31:38-4 shows Jacob's frustration. I have been with you for 20 years now. Your sheep and goats have not miscarried, nor have I eaten rams from your flocks. I did not bring you animals torn by wild beasts. I bore the loss myself, and you demanded payment from me for whatever was stolen by day or night. This was my situation. The heat consumed me in the daytime, and the cold at night, and sleep fled from my eyes. After some tense negotiations, Jacob and Laban made a covenant of peace. They set up a stone pillar as a witness that neither would harm the other. Genesis 31:49 records part of their agreement. It was also called Mizpah because he said, May the Lord keep watch between you and me when we are away from each other. With this conflict resolved, Jacob continued toward home. But now he faced an even bigger problem. His brother Esau, who had threatened to kill him 20 years earlier, as Jacob approached the land where Esau lived, his fear grew overwhelming. He sent messengers ahead to announce his return, hoping to make peace with his brother. But the messengers came back with the disturbing news. Genesis 32:6 records their report. When the messengers returned to Jacob, they said, We went to your brother Esau, and now he is coming to meet you. And 400 men are with him. 400 men are with him. This sounded like a war party, not a welcome committee. Jacob was terrified. Genesis 32:7 describes his reaction. In great fear and distress, Jacob divided the people who were with him into 2 groups, and the flocks and herds and camels as well. Jacob's plan was simple. If Esau attacked one group, maybe the other could escape. But he also did something more important. He prayed. Genesis 32:9-12 records his desperate prayer. Then Jacob prayed, O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, Lord, you who said to me, Go back to your country and your relatives, and I will make you prosper. I am unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness you have shown your servant. I had only my staff when I crossed this Jordan, but now I have become 2 camps. Save me, I pray, from the hand of my brother Esau, for I am afraid he will come and attack me, and also the mothers with their children. But you have said, I will surely make you prosper, and will make your descendants like the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted. This was one of Jacob's most honest prayers. He acknowledged his unworthiness, admitted his fear, and reminded God of his promises. Then he prepared an enormous gift for Esau. Hundreds of goats, sheep, camels, cattle, and donkeys sent ahead in separate groups to impress his brother with his wealth and generosity. After sending his family across the Jabbok River, Jacob spent the night alone. This was when the most important event of his life happened. Genesis 32:24-26 describes the mysterious encounter. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, Let me go, for it is daybreak. But Jacob replied, I will not let you go unless you bless me. All night long Jacob wrestled with this mysterious figure. The man was strong enough to dislocate Jacob's hip with a touch, showing that he was more than human. But Jacob refused to give up even when he was injured. He held on desperately, demanding a blessing. Then came the moment that changed everything. Genesis 32:27-28 records the transformation. The man asked him, What is your name? Jacob, he answered. Then the man said, Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome. Jacob's name was changed to Israel, which meant he struggles with God, or God strives. The man he had wrestled with was God himself, appearing in human form. Jacob had literally wrestled with God all night and had prevailed through persistent faith. Genesis 32:29-31 concludes this incredible encounter. Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Peniel meant face of God. Jacob had seen God face to face and lived to tell about it, but he carried a permanent reminder of this encounter, a limp that would stay with him for the rest of his life. This wrestling match was more than a physical struggle. It represented Jacob's spiritual journey. He had spent his whole life struggling with his brother in the womb, with Esau for the birthright and blessing, with Laban for his wives and wealth. Now he had struggled with God himself and had been transformed. He was no longer Jacob the suppler, but Israel, the one who had prevailed with God. When Jacob finally met Esau, the reunion was peaceful and emotional. The brothers embraced and wept, and Esau showed no sign of the murderous anger he had harbored 20 years earlier. Jacob settled in the land near Shechem, where he bought a piece of property and built an altar. But living among the Canaanites brought new dangers for Jacob's family. Genesis 34:1-2 describes a terrible incident. Now Dinah, the daughter Leah, had borne to Jacob, went out to visit the women of the land. When Shem, son of Hamoreh the Hivite, the ruler of that area, saw her, he took her and raped her. Dinah was probably a teenager when this happened. Shem, the son of the local prince, saw her and violated her. This was not just a personal crime, but an attack on Jacob's entire family honor. But then something unexpected happened. Genesis 34:3-4 tells us, his heart was drawn to Dinah, daughter of Jacob. He loved the young woman and spoke tenderly to her. And Shechem said to his father, "Hamor, get me this girl as my wife." Shechem had fallen in love with Dinah after assaulting her, and he wanted to marry her. His father, Hamor, came to Jacob to arrange the marriage as if the rape had never happened. When Jacob's sons heard what had happened to their sister, they were furious. Genesis 34:7 describes their anger. Meanwhile, Jacob's sons had come in from the fields as soon as they heard what had happened. They were shocked and furious because Shechem had done an outrageous thing in Israel by sleeping with Jacob's daughter, a thing that should not be done. The sons of Jacob pretended to agree to the marriage, but they had a condition. Genesis 34:14-16 records their deceptive proposal. They said to them, "We cannot do such a thing. We cannot give our sister to a man who is not circumcised. That would be a disgrace to us. We will enter into an agreement with you on one condition only, that you become like us by circumcising all your males. Then we will give you our daughters and take your daughters for ourselves. We'll settle among you and become one people with you." Hamor and Shem agreed to this condition. They convinced all the men of their city to be circumcised, promising that it would lead to profitable relationships with Jacob's wealthy family. But Jacob's sons had no intention of keeping their agreement. Genesis 34:25-26 describes their brutal revenge. 3 days later, while all of them were still in pain, 2 of Jacob's sons, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, took their swords and attacked Thea, unsuspecting city, killing every male. They put Hamor and his son Shechem to the sword and took Dinah from Shechem's house and left. While the men were recovering from circumcision and unable to defend themselves, Simeon and Levi slaughtered them all. Then the other brothers joined in looting the city and taking all the women and children as captives. Jacob was horrified by his sons' actions. Genesis 34:30 shows his fear. Then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, "You have brought trouble on me by making me obnoxious to the Canaanites and Perizzites, the people living in this land. We are few in number, and if they join forces against me and attack me, I and my household will be destroyed." Jacob was worried about retaliation from the other Canaanite tribes. His sons had made enemies of everyone in the region, but Simeon and Levi were unrepentant. Genesis 34:31 records their defiant response, but they replied, "Should he have treated our sister like a prostitute?" This incident showed the ongoing problems in Jacob's family. His sons were capable of terrible violence when they felt their honor had been attacked. The favoritism and dysfunction that had marked their births continued to create conflict and pain. After these troubles, Jacob moved his family away from Shechem. God appeared to him again and confirmed his new name and the covenant promises. Genesis 35:112 records God's words. "And God said to him, I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and increase in number. A nation and a community of nations will come from you, and kings will be among your descendants. The land I gave to Abraham and Isaac, I also give to you, and I will give this land to your descendants after you." But tragedy struck the family when Rachel, Jacob's beloved wife, died, giving birth to her second son. Genesis 35:16-18 describes her death. Then they moved on from Bethel while they were still some distance from Ephrath. Rachel began to give birth and had great difficulty. And as she was having great difficulty in childbirth, the midwife said to her, "Don't despair, for you have another son." As she breathed her last, she named him Ben-Oni, but his father named him Benjamin. Rachel died giving birth to Benjamin, whose name meant "son of my right hand." Her dying wish was to name him Ben-Oni, meaning "son of my trouble." But Jacob changed it to something more hopeful. Jacob now had 12 sons, but his favoritism continued to cause problems. Genesis 37:3-4 describes the situation. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph was Rachel's firstborn son, born when Jacob was old, and Jacob couldn't hide his special love for him. The ornate robe, often called a coat of many colors, was a visible symbol of Jacob's favoritism. It was the kind of robe worn by royalty, or someone who didn't have to do manual labor. Joseph's brothers already hated him for being their father's favorite. But then Joseph made things worse by telling them about his dreams. Genesis 37:5-8 describes the first dream. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaf of grain out in the field, when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright while your sheaf gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brother said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Joseph's dream showed his brothers' grain bundles bowing down to his bundle, a clear picture of them serving him. This was the last thing his brothers wanted to hear from their already favored younger brother. But Joseph had another dream that was even more provocative. Genesis 37:9. 1:1 tells us, "Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. Listen, he said, I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground for you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. In this second dream, the sun, moon, and 11 stars bowed to Joseph, representing his father, mother, and 11 brothers, all bowing down to him. Even Jacob was disturbed by this dream, though he wondered if it might be from God. Joseph was only 17 years old, and he didn't have the wisdom to keep these dreams to himself. He may have been sharing them innocently, not realizing how much they would anger his brothers. But God was already revealing his plan for Joseph's future, even though it would take many years and much suffering before those dreams came true. The stage was set for the next great chapter in the story of God's people. Joseph's brothers' hatred would soon lead to actions that would change the course of history, taking the family of Israel down to Egypt and setting up the events that would eventually lead to the Exodus and the birth of the nation of Israel. One day, Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers who were pasturing the flocks in Dothan. When the brothers saw Joseph approaching in his special robe, the anger they had harbored for so long finally exploded. Genesis 37:18-20 records their conspiratorial words. But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns, and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." But Reuben, the oldest brother, tried to save Joseph's life. He suggested they throw Joseph into a cistern without killing him, planning to rescue him later. When Joseph arrived, his brothers stripped off his ornate robe and threw him into an empty cistern. While they were eating their meal, a caravan of Ishmaelite merchants appeared, heading toward Egypt. Judah had an idea that would solve their problem without bloodshed. Genesis 37:26-27 shows his proposal. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Israelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own." Flesh and blood, his brothers agreed. So they sold Joseph to the merchants for 20 shekels of silver. Genesis 37:28 records the transaction. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the system and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites who took him to Egypt. To cover up their crime, the brothers killed a goat and dipped Joseph's robe in its blood. They brought the bloodied robe to their father, letting him draw his own conclusions. Genesis 37:32-35 describes Jacob's heartbreak. They took the ornate robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, Joseph was being taken to Egypt as a slave, sold to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard. Everything had changed in a single day, from favored son to foreign slave. Despite being a slave in a foreign land, Joseph didn't give up hope. Genesis 39:2-4 tells us about God's blessing on his life. "The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. Joseph's character and competence were so evident that Potiphar promoted him to oversee his entire household. Genesis 39:5-6 shows the extent of Joseph's authority. From the time he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. But Joseph's success created a new problem. He was handsome, and Potiphar's wife began to notice him. Genesis 39:7 describes her proposition, and after a while his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." Joseph refused her advances repeatedly, explaining his reasoning in Genesis 3:9, 8-9, but he refused with me in charge. He told her, "My master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me, except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" Joseph's refusal was based on three principles: loyalty to his master, respect for marriage, and reverence for God. Even though he was far from home and no one would know, he wouldn't compromise his integrity. Day after day, Potiphar's wife persisted in her attempts to seduce Joseph. Finally, she tried to force herself on him. Genesis 39:11-12 describes the confrontation. One day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. Humiliated by Joseph's rejection, Potiphar's wife decided to destroy him. She used his cloak as evidence and accused him of attempted rape. Genesis 39:17-18 records her lie. Then she told him this story: "That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me, but as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." Potiphar believed his wife's story and had Joseph thrown into prison. Genesis 39:20 tells us, "Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him." Even in prison, God's favor remained on Joseph. The warden soon put him in charge of all the prisoners because of his trustworthy character and administrative skills. While in prison, Joseph met two of Pharaoh's officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, who had been imprisoned for offending the king. One night, both men had troubling dreams that they couldn't understand. Genesis 46:8 describes their distress. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials, who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why do you look so sad today?" "We both had dreams," they answered, "but there is no one to interpret them." Then Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." The cupbearer told his dream first. He had seen a vine with 3 branches that budded, blossomed, and produced grapes. He squeezed the grapes into Pharaoh's cup and gave it to him. Joseph interpreted this as good news. In 3 days, the cupbearer would be restored to his position. The baker's dream was different. He carried 3 baskets of bread on his head, but birds ate the bread from the top basket. Joseph's interpretation was grim. In 3 days, the baker would be executed. Both interpretations came true, exactly as Joseph predicted. Genesis 40:20-22 confirms. Now the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, so that he once again put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he impaled the chief baker, just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation. Before the cupbearer left prison, Joseph made a request. Genesis 40:14-15 records his plea. "But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon." But Genesis 40:23 tells us the disappointing result. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. Joseph remained in prison for 2 more years, forgotten by the man whose life he had saved through interpretation. 2 years later, Pharaoh himself had troubling dreams that none of his wise men could interpret. In his first dream, 7 fat cows were devoured by 7 lean cows. In his second dream, 7 healthy heads of grain were swallowed by 7 thin heads of grain. Finally, the cupbearer remembered Joseph. Genesis 41:9-13 shows his testimony to Pharaoh. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, "Today I am reminded of my shortcomings." Pharaoh was once angry with his servants, and he imprisoned me and the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard. Each of us had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Now a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us, giving each man the interpretation of his dream. And things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. Pharaoh immediately summoned Joseph from prison, after quickly shaving and changing clothes. Joseph stood before the most powerful man in Egypt. Genesis 41:15-16 records their conversation. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I had a dream, and no one can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you, that when you hear a dream you can interpret it. I cannot do it," Joseph replied to Pharaoh. But God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. Even in this moment of opportunity, Joseph gave credit to God rather than claiming the ability for himself. After hearing both dreams, Joseph provided the interpretation. The dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. And the 7 years, it is one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterward are 7 years. And so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. Joseph explained that Egypt would exact. Experience 7 years of abundance followed, by 7 years of severe famine. But he didn't stop with interpretation. He also provided a solution. Genesis 41:336 records his recommendation. "And now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man, and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming, and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the country to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine." Pharaoh was so impressed with Joseph's wisdom that he immediately appointed him as his second in command. Genesis 41:39-41 describes this dramatic promotion. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt." In a single day, Joseph went from prisoner to prime minister. Pharaoh gave him his signet ring, fine linen clothes, a gold chain, and his own chariot. At age 30, the Hebrew slave became the most powerful man in Egypt after Pharaoh himself. During the 7 years of abundance, Joseph efficiently organized the collection and storage of grain throughout Egypt. Genesis 41:47-49 describes the incredible harvest. During the 7 years of abundance, the land produced plentifully. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in the cities. In each city, he put the food grown in the fields surrounding it. Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. During this prosperous time, Joseph married Asenath, daughter of an Egyptian priest, and had 2 sons. Genesis 41:55-552 tells us about his family. Before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph by Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh, and said, "It is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household." The second son he named Ephraim, and said, "It is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering." The names reflected Joseph's emotional journey. Manasseh meant causing to forget. God had helped him move past the pain of his brother's betrayal. If meant fruitful, God had blessed him abundantly. even in a foreign land. When the 7 years of abundance ended, the famine began exactly as Joseph had predicted. Genesis 41:54-57 describes its severity. And the 7 years of famine began just as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the other lands, but in the whole land of Egypt there was food. When all Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried to Pharaoh for food. Then Pharaoh told all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph and do what he tells you." When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians. For the famine was severe throughout Egypt, and all the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph. Because the famine was severe everywhere. The famine wasn't limited to Egypt. It affected all the surrounding regions, including Canaan, where Jacob and his sons lived. Egypt became the only source of food for survival. When Jacob heard that there was grain available in Egypt, he sent 10 of his sons to buy food, keeping only Benjamin at home because he was afraid something might happen to Rachel's other son. Genesis 42:3-6 describes their arrival. Then 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt. But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with the others, because he was afraid that harm might come to him. So Israel's sons were among those who went to buy grain, for there was famine in the land of Canaan too. Now Joseph was the governor of the land, the person who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. The moment Joseph had dreamed about as a 17-year-old boy had finally come true. His brothers were bowing down to him, but they didn't recognize him. 20 years had passed. He was dressed as an Egyptian official, and they thought he was dead. Joseph recognized them immediately, but decided to test them before revealing his identity. Genesis 42:7-9 shows his strategy. Although Joseph recognized his brothers, he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. "Where do you come from?" he asked. "From the land of Canaan," they replied, "to buy food." Then Joseph remembered his dreams about them and said to them, "You are spies. You have come to see where our land is unprotected." Joseph accused them of being spies and demanded proof of their story. He insisted that one brother return home to bring Benjamin while the others remained in prison. After 3 days, he modified his demand. One brother would stay in prison while the others returned home with grain, but they must bring Benjamin back to prove their honesty. The brothers were terrified and began talking among themselves in Hebrew, not knowing that Joseph could understand them. Genesis 42:21-22 records their guilty conversation. They said to one another, "Surely we are being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. That's why this distress has come on us." Reuben replied, "Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? But you wouldn't listen. Now we must give an accounting for his blood." Hearing his brothers express remorse for what they had done to him, Joseph had to turn away to weep. Their guilt had haunted them for 20 years. He kept Simeon as a hostage and sent the others home with grain, secretly returning their money in their sacks. When the brothers told Jacob everything that had happened, he was devastated. Genesis 42:36 shows his anguish. Their father Jacob said to them, "You have deprived me of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and now you want to take Benjamin. Everything is against me." Jacob refused to let Benjamin go to Egypt, even though it meant Simeon would remain imprisoned. But as the famine continued and their food ran out, they had no choice but to return to Egypt. When their grain was almost gone, Jacob reluctantly agreed to send Benjamin to Egypt, along with double the money and gifts for the Egyptian governor. Genesis 43:14 shows his resignation. Then their father Israel said to them, "If it must be, then do this. Put some of the best products of the land in your bags and take them down to the man as a gift, a little balm and a little honey, some spices, and myrrh, some pistachio nuts and almonds. Take double the amount of silver with you, for you must return the silver that was put back into the mouths of your sacks. Perhaps it was a mistake. Take your brother also, and go back to the man at once. And may God Almighty grant you mercy before the man, so that he will let your other brother and Benjamin come back with you. As for me, if I am bereaved, I am bereaved." When Joseph saw Benjamin with his brothers, he was overwhelmed with emotion. He invited them all to dine at his house, seating them in birth order, something that amazed them, since this Egyptian official couldn't possibly know their ages. Genesis 43:33-34 describes the meal. The men had been seated before him in the order of their ages, from the firstborn to the youngest, and they looked at each other in astonishment when portions were served to them from Joseph's table. Benjamin's portion was 5 times as much as anyone else's. So they feasted and drank freely with him. Joseph was testing his brothers again, showing special favor to Benjamin to see if they would be jealous as they had been of him. But this time, the brothers seemed genuinely happy for Benjamin's good fortune. The next morning, Joseph sent his brothers away with grain, but he had his silver cup planted in Benjamin's sack. When the brothers were overtaken and searched, the cup was found, and they were all brought back to face Joseph's wrath. Genesis 44:16-17 shows their despair. "What can we say to my lord?" Judah replied, "What can we say? How can we prove our innocence? God has uncovered your servants' guilt. We are now my lord's slaves, we ourselves, and the one who was found to have the cup." But Joseph said, "Far be it from me to do such a thing. Only the man who was found to have the cup will become my slave. The rest of you go back to your father in peace." This was the ultimate test. Would the brothers abandon Benjamin as they had abandoned Joseph, or had they truly changed? Judah's response revealed their transformation. Genesis 44:18-34 records his passionate plea. Then Judah went up to him and said, "Pardon your servant, my lord. Let me speak a word to my lord. Do not be angry with your servant, though you are equal to Pharaoh himself. Now then, please let your servant remain here as my lord's slave in place of the boy, and let the boy return with his brothers. How can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? No, do not let me see the misery that would come on my father." Judah, who had once suggested selling Joseph, was now willing to become a slave himself to save Benjamin and spare their father's grief. The brothers had truly changed. Unable to contain himself any longer, Joseph dismissed all his attendants and revealed his identity. Genesis 4:5. 3:4 describes the dramatic moment. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt." The brothers were shocked and terrified, but Joseph quickly reassured them. Genesis 45:55, 55:8 shows his perspective on their past actions. "And now, do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now, there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler of all Egypt." Joseph saw God's hand in everything that had happened. What his brothers meant for evil, God had used for good to save many lives during the famine. Joseph told his brothers to bring their father and all their families to Egypt, where they could survive the remaining years of famine. When Jacob heard that Joseph was alive and ruling in Egypt, Genesis 45:26-28 describes his reaction. They told him, "Joseph is still alive. In fact, he is ruler of all Egypt." Jacob was stunned. He did not believe them. But when they told him everything Joseph had said to them, and when he saw the carts Joseph had sent to carry him back, the spirit of their father Jacob revived, and Israel said, "I'm convinced my son Joseph is still alive. I will go and see him before I die." God appeared to Jacob in a vision at Beersah, encouraging him to go to Egypt. Genesis 46:3 records God's promise. "I am God, the God of your father." He said, "Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there. I will go down to Egypt with you, and I will surely bring you back again, and Joseph's own hand will close your eyes." Genesis 46:27 tells us the total number who went to Egypt with the 2 sons who had been born to Joseph in Egypt. The members of Jacob's family which went to Egypt were 70 in all. The reunion between Jacob and Joseph was emotional beyond words. Genesis 46:29-30 describes the moment. Joseph had his chariot made ready and went to Gan to meet his father Israel. As soon as Joseph appeared before him, he threw his arms around his father and wept for a long time. Israel said to Joseph, "Now I am ready to die, since I have seen for myself that you are still alive." Pharaoh welcomed Jacob's family and gave them the best land in Egypt, the region of Gan, where they could raise their flocks and herds. What had begun as a temporary refuge during famine would become a 430-year sojourn that would transform Jacob's family into the nation of Israel. Jacob lived in Egypt for 17 years, seeing his family prosper and multiply. As his death approached, he called Joseph to make a special request about his burial. Then he blessed Joseph's 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, adopting them as his own sons and giving them equal inheritance with his other sons. In a prophetic move that surprised Joseph, Jacob gave the greater blessing to Ephraim, the younger son, rather than Manasseh, the firstborn. Genesis 48:19 records Jacob's explanation. But his father refused and said, "I know why, my son. I know. He too will become a people, and he too will become great. Nevertheless, his younger brother will be greater than he, and his descendants will become a group of nations." Finally, Jacob called all his sons together to give them prophetic blessings before his death. Genesis 49 records these detailed prophecies about each tribe's future. Some blessings were positive, like Judah's. "The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he to whom it belongs shall come, and the obedience of the nations shall be his." Others carried consequences for past actions, like Simeon and Levi's curse for their violence at Shechem. "I will scatter them in Jacob and disperse them in Israel." Genesis 49:33 describes Jacob's peaceful death. When Jacob had finished giving instructions to his sons, he drew his feet up into the bed, breathed his last, and was gathered to his people. Joseph mourned deeply for his father and had him embalmed according to Egyptian custom. With Pharaoh's permission, he took Jacob's body back to Canaan to be buried in the cave of Machpelah with Abraham, Isaac, and their wives. After Jacob's death, Joseph's brothers worried that he might finally take revenge on them. Genesis 50:15 shows their fear. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" But Joseph's response revealed the depth of his forgiveness and spiritual maturity. Genesis 50:19-21 records his famous words. "But Joseph said to them, 'Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children.'" And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. Joseph lived to be 110 years old, seeing his great-great-grandchildren before his death. Genesis 50:24-25 tells us his final words to his brothers. "Then Joseph said to his brothers, 'I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.' And Joseph made the Israelites swear an oath and said, 'God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place.' Even in death, Joseph's faith remained fixed on God's promises. He knew that Egypt was not their permanent home. God would eventually bring his people back to the promised land. Genesis 50:26 concludes the book with Joseph's death. So, Joseph died at the age of 110, and after they embalmed him, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. The book of Genesis ends with God's people in Egypt, far from the promised land, but positioned for the next great chapter in his plan. What began with creation continued through the fall and developed through God's covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob now set the stage for the formation of the nation of Israel and their eventual exodus back to the land God had promised their fathers. Through all the stories of Genesis, from Adam's disobedience to Joseph's forgiveness, we see the consistent theme of God's faithfulness to his promises, his ability to work through flawed human beings, and his ultimate plan to bless all nations through the descendants of Abraham. If this journey through Genesis has inspired you, challenged you, or helped you see God's hand in human history, I'd love for you to be part of our community. Please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you won't miss our upcoming videos as we continue through the Bible together. Your subscription helps us reach more people with these timeless stories that have shaped our world. And don't keep this incredible story to yourself. Share this video with your friends, family, and anyone who could benefit from understanding how our world began and how God has been working throughout history. Whether they're believers seeking deeper understanding or skeptics curious about these foundational stories, everyone can appreciate the literary beauty, historical significance, and profound truths found in Genesis. Leave a comment below and let me know which story from Genesis impacted you the most. Was it Adam and Eve's fall from paradise? Abraham's incredible faith journey? Joseph's forgiveness of his brothers? I read every comment and love hearing how these ancient stories speak to modern hearts. Hit that like button if you found value in this comprehensive journey through Genesis, and share it on your social media to help others discover these amazing stories. Together, we can help more people understand the foundation of human history and God's eternal plan of redemption. Thank you for joining me on this remarkable adventure through the Book of Beginnings. Until next time, may you find hope in knowing that the same God who created the stars called Abraham, wrestled with Jacob, and worked through Joseph's suffering, is still at work in your life today. The story that began in Genesis continues, in your heart and in your story. Subscribe, share, and I'll see you in the next video.